It was meant to be a simple dinner party, a reunion of old friends, a night of laughter, and a casual escape from the pressures of life. I had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary, and yet, as I stood beside Rachel, my wife of 8 years, something didn't feel right. The air was charged with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place, a tension that seemed to pulse between her and Tom. Tom was always a little too charming, too quick with a joke or a compliment, but tonight it was different. He lingered around Rachel as if he were trying too hard to be near her. His hand would brush against her arm whenever he passed, and I saw the way her eyes followed him with more interest than they should have. She tried to mask it, smiling brightly at others in the room, but I knew my wife well enough to recognize when something was off. I brushed it off at first. After all, I had no reason to be suspicious, no hard evidence to accuse her of anything. We'd been through difficult times, sure, but nothing that had warranted distrust. Rachel had always been the life of the party, charming everyone she met with ease, and I was proud of how effortlessly she moved through social circles. But tonight, there was something different in the way she looked at him. It wasn't the casual friendliness she extended to everyone else, it was something more, something secret. And I kept my gaze on them from across the room, pretending to engage in a conversation with Daniel from the law firm, but my mind was elsewhere, tracking their every move. Rachel was laughing, her head tilting back a little too far as Tom leaned in just a touch closer than was appropriate. The others at the table were busy with their own chatter, but I felt this sharp awareness in my gut, a growing sense that something was unfolding right under my nose. I stood up to refill my drink, hoping a moment away from the table would help me shake the feeling gnawing at me. As I turned to walk to the kitchen, I saw it the briefest exchange between Rachel and Tom. She looked up at him as if she were listening intently, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. Then, as if they were both part of some unscripted play, they both glanced at the door leading to the hallway, as if making sure no one was watching. That's when it hit me: Rachel and Tom were conspiring silently. Something was happening between them, and I wasn't going to wait around to figure out what it was. The evening was starting to feel like a slow unraveling, each moment stretching out into something uncomfortable. The chatter around me faded as my attention locked onto Rachel and Tom, who had, by now, developed an almost synchronized rhythm in their interactions. I had hoped to dismiss the growing sense of unease that had taken root, but every glance between them felt like a subtle betrayal, each smile they exchanged like a secret language only they understood. Dessert was served, and everyone gathered around the table to indulge in the rich, decadent layers of chocolate mousse. But as I reached for my spoon, I noticed that Rachel wasn't at her usual spot beside me. I glanced up, and there she was, standing at the far end of the room, talking to Tom. The way they stood together felt wrong, a little too close for comfort, even by the relaxed standards of our group of friends. Tom's hand was on her arm now, and though his touch seemed casual, there was an undeniable intimacy in the way Rachel didn't pull away. Her smile was soft, almost secretive, and she leaned in as if sharing something private. My heart skipped a beat, and an irrational flare of anger rose in my chest. I couldn't help myself. I stood up abruptly, as if to grab a napkin from the counter, but my eyes never left them. Rachel laughed at something Tom had said, her hand brushing lightly against his. It was a moment too soft, too familiar. In all the years I'd known her, I'd never seen her like this with anyone else, not in public, not in front of me. She had always been affectionate, but there was a line between friendly gestures and what was happening now. And it wasn't just a momentary lapse. I moved through the room, as if I were still part of the conversation, trying to keep my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. I couldn't ignore the feeling in my chest, that deep, gnawing sensation that something was about to happen, something I would never be able to forget. And then it happened. Rachel and Tom, in an almost synchronized move, stood up from the table. Rachel shot me a quick glance, her eyes widening for a second before she looked away, as though she were caught doing something she shouldn't. Tom, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice anything wrong. He just offered one of his signature half smiles, the kind that always managed to charm everyone into overlooking his more reckless behaviors. They started to move toward the hallway at the back of the house. It wasn't unusual for people to step away from the table to get a break, but I noticed how quickly they left, as if they had been waiting for the right moment. There was no casualness to their departure, it was deliberate. And that's when I realized it wasn't just an innocent conversation they were having. They weren't stepping outside for air. I didn't wait for the moment to pass. I stood frozen for a second, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. Should I follow them? Was I just being paranoid, letting a feeling of insecurity cloud my judgment? But then the thought of how many times I had blindly trusted Rachel in the past, of how much I had invested in our life together, pushed me forward. I couldn't shake the instinct, that primal feeling that I was about to watch my life collapse in real time. I followed them down the hall, keeping my footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. The house was quiet now, the music from the dining room muffled. I reached the corner just as I saw them slip into the study. There was a moment of hesitation, but I steeled myself, taking one last breath. Then, without thinking, I leaned forward, just enough to peek around the doorframe. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. Tom was standing much too close to Rachel, his hands cupping her face as he kissed her. It was slow and deliberate, an act that seemed both tender and reckless. Rachel's eyes were closed, her body pressed into his, as there was no one else in the world, no one else who mattered. My chest tightened, my stomach roiled, and every rational thought in my head disappeared in that instant. They didn't notice me standing there, didn't hear the quiet sound of my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch, as the pieces of my life, the trust I had in my marriage, and the foundation of everything we had built together shattered in a moment of pure, unfiltered betrayal. The shock lingered in the pit of my stomach as I stood there, frozen in the hallway, watching Rachel and Tom. The image of them, entwined in each other's arms, was seared into my mind, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest. It was almost as if the world had gone silent, like everything else had faded away, leaving only this moment, this undeniable truth. But I couldn't stand there forever. I had to do something. I had to act, because if I didn't, I would never forgive myself. The rational part of me screamed to turn around, to walk away, and process it in private. But the anger, the sense of betrayal, was too overwhelming to ignore. I couldn't let them get away with this, pretending nothing had happened, pretending that everything was still normal. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my ears, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. As I retraced my steps toward the dining room, the reality of what I'd seen set in with full force. I couldn't bring myself to look at the others in the room, their laughter. Their easy conversation felt like a mockery. How many of them had been blind to the cracks in our relationship? How many of them had noticed the same things I had, but said nothing? I walked past the table, not even sparing a glance at Rachel's empty chair. My gaze was fixed on the door, the entryway to the room where Tom and Rachel were together, without a care in the world. I felt something primal stirring inside me, an urge to do something, to stop them from pretending like everything was fine. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I couldn't let this moment pass. I was halfway across the room when I saw Rachel and Tom emerge from the hallway. They were talking, laughing now, as though nothing had happened. Rachel's hair was disheveled, and there was a small smudge of lipstick on her cheek. She didn't even seem to notice, didn't see me standing there, or if she did, she didn't acknowledge me. I couldn't hold it back any longer. "Rachel," I said, my voice steady, but tight with something unrecognizable. She stopped mid-step, her eyes darting to me. Her face went pale. Tom, too, glanced over, but his confidence faltered for a second. They were caught, and there was no way out of it. "You're back," Rachel said, her voice strained, as if she could still pretend that everything was fine, that nothing had happened. She attempted to smile, but it was forced, desperate. I didn't care about her attempt to play it off. I wasn't going to be passive, not anymore. I had already seen everything, every kiss, every stolen moment. The truth was there, plain and unambiguous. "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "I'm not back. I never left." Rachel's eyes widened, the mask slipping for just a second. She looked over at Tom, who, despite his usual bravado, was now standing frozen. His smile had vanished, replaced by a twinge of uncertainty. But Rachel tried to recover. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "I saw you," I continued, my voice cutting through the strained silence. "I saw everything. You and Tom, together. I saw you kiss him. I saw you." I swallowed hard, fighting the sudden wave of nausea. "You're not just sneaking around. You're letting it happen, right in front of everyone." I watched her face crumble, just for a moment. The cool, confident facade that she had built around herself cracked open, revealing something raw beneath the surface. Shame, guilt, and maybe fear. The room fell silent, the once lively chatter of the other guests grinding to a halt as the weight of the revelation settled over them. I could feel their eyes on me, on Rachel, on Tom. No one moved, no one spoke. Rachel opened her mouth again, but this time the words didn't come out with the same confidence. She wasn't trying to justify herself anymore, wasn't spinning some elaborate excuse. It was as though she knew that nothing could save her now. Her betrayal had been exposed, and there was no escaping it. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, she finally said, her voice shaking. Daniel, please. But I didn't want her apology. I didn't need her explanation. I didn't want her words because they were hollow now, empty. Save it, I said, turning away from her, my voice cold. You've already said everything with your actions. The truth hung between us like a heavy curtain. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I wasn't sure if I was shaking from anger or something else, but in that moment I felt clarity. The mask of marriage, of loyalty had slipped away, and there was no going back. The room felt suffocating now, heavy with the silence that followed my words. I barely registered the shocked expressions on the faces of our friends. Some were stunned into silence, others awkwardly shifting in their seats, unsure whether to look at Rachel or me. But there was no mistaking it. Rachel's affair with Tom was no longer a secret. It had been exposed in front of everyone. I turned my back on them both, though I could feel their eyes on me. Rachel's breath hitched behind me, her footsteps hesitant as she called my name, but I couldn't bring myself to face her. Not now, not after everything. Daniel, Rachel tried again, her voice strained, but I didn't stop. There was nothing left for me to hear from her, nothing she could say that would change what had already happened. What was the point of pleading? The truth had been laid bare, and there was no rewinding this moment. Behind me, I heard Tom shift uncomfortably, his confident posture now a farce. His usual swagger had melted away, and in its place was a man caught in the consequences of his actions, exposed and vulnerable in a way that I had never seen him before. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never seemed to come. All he managed was a weak attempt at defense, his voice faltering. Look, Daniel, it's not what it seems. Don't, I cut him off sharply, my voice low but firm. You don't get to justify this. You knew exactly what you were doing. Both of you did. There was no room left for explanations. What would it change? What was left to salvage? Tom glanced around, his eyes darting from Rachel to the others in the room. His typical self-assurance had evaporated, leaving a man who realized too late that no one would come to his defense. His reputation was ruined, his charm useless in the face of such a glaring betrayal. Rachel, on the other hand, was a different story. She was still trying to hold it together, but her hands were shaking, her makeup now smudged. The woman who had once been so composed, so confident, was crumbling right before my eyes. She opened her mouth again, her words rushed, her tone pleading. Please, Daniel, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. You have to understand. But I couldn't understand. Not anymore. Not after everything. The more she spoke, the further I felt from her. There was a distance now, an insurmountable gap between us. I had trusted her in a way that I could never trust her again. The love I thought was unbreakable was now shattered, lying in pieces around us like broken glass. I don't care, I said, turning my back on her. I'm done. I walked toward the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I didn't care what anyone else thought. I had nothing left to prove to them. Nothing left to prove to Rachel. What was there to salvage from a marriage built on lies? What could I possibly gain from staying in a relationship where the truth was so casually disregarded? I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap, grounding me in the harsh reality of what had just transpired. My mind raced as I tried to process the night, the broken promises, the destruction of everything I had built with Rachel. I couldn't understand how it had come to this. How had I missed the signs? How had I allowed myself to ignore the little things that had felt off, the subtle distance between us that had now exploded into something unrecognizable? Inside, I could hear the faint sounds of Rachel and Tom's voices, muffled by the door. The others in the room were likely still grappling with what they had witnessed, their uncomfortable glances exchanged in the aftermath of the confrontation. But none of it mattered anymore. Nothing mattered except the bitter, cold realization that everything I had believed in was a lie. I wasn't angry, not in the way I thought I would be. I didn't feel rage or a need for revenge. Instead, there was a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. It wasn't the betrayal itself that hurt the most, it was the loss. The loss of the life I had imagined. The life I thought we had together. As I stood in the driveway, the night stretching out before me, I realized that I had just taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. Rachel's pleas, Tom's excuses, the disbelief of our friends, it all meant nothing now. There was only one thing left to do, move on. And though I had no idea what that would look like, it was the only thing I could do now. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a haze, as if the world had shifted into some surreal version of itself where nothing made sense. I didn't know how to explain to anyone what had happened. How do you tell people that the life you'd built, the foundation you'd trusted, had disintegrated in a single moment? How do you even begin to process something that cuts so deeply, so personally, that you can't tell where the hurt ends and where the rage begins? Rachel called me several times over the next few days, but I didn't pick up. I knew she was trying to apologize, trying to make excuses, to explain it away with words. But I didn't want her words. There was nothing she could say that would undo what I had seen, what I had felt in the seconds before I turned my back on her. I couldn't stand to hear her voice, not when I knew she was begging for forgiveness that had already been lost. A week passed before she showed up at the apartment. I wasn't expecting her. I had been avoiding the house where we'd lived together for years. Too many memories attached to the walls, too many lies buried in the corners. The apartment was quieter now, emptier. But the stillness felt like a relief. She knocked once, softly, as if unsure of what to say or how to enter. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see that she had come alone. Tom was nowhere in sight, which told me that whatever they had once shared had crumbled just as quickly as our marriage had. The fact that she came without him felt almost like a sign, like she was trying to regain some semblance of dignity. But I wasn't interested in her dignity anymore. "Daniel," she said, her voice tremulous. She looked different, her face pale and drawn, the usual vibrancy drained from her. She didn't look like the woman I had married. "Can we talk?" I stood in the doorway, not sure if I even wanted to hear what she had to say. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to erase the image of her with Tom still fresh in my mind. But another part of me, a part one hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment, wanted to hear her say it, whatever it was, that would finally give me the closure I needed. I stepped aside and let her in, but I didn't sit down. I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to make this conversation feel like anything other than what it was, an ending. "Do you want a drink?" I asked, though the offer was hollow. I didn't really care whether she drank or not. It was just something to fill the silence between us. "No," she said, shaking her head. I just need to apologize for everything. I know I hurt you. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." I didn't respond right away. Her words were empty, no matter how heartfelt she tried to make them sound. I could see the tears gathering in her eyes, the raw emotion that now leaked through the cracks in her carefully constructed persona. She had always been so composed, so controlled, but now she was stripped bare, vulnerable in a way that felt almost pitiful. "I never meant to destroy you," she continued, her voice shaking. "I never meant for things to go this far. But I was lost, and I didn't know how to talk to you about it." "Lost?" I echoed, the bitterness creeping into my voice before I could stop it. "You were lost, so you decided to betray me, to tear apart everything we had. You couldn't talk to me, but you could talk to him." She flinched at my words, as if I had physically struck her. Her face contorted in pain, but it wasn't the pain of guilt, it was the pain of realizing that she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. "I don't know what I was thinking," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "I just wanted something different, something I thought I could never have with you." The words hit me harder than I expected. It was one thing to feel betrayed. It was another to hear that your partner had sought something outside the relationship because they no longer believed in the bond between you. She didn't just cheat on me, she had given up on us before I even had a chance to see it. I clenched my fists, the urge to scream at her, to demand answers, almost overwhelming. But instead I stood there, fighting back the torrent of emotions that threatened to drown me. My silence was the only thing I could control now. "I didn't want to destroy us," she said again, more softly this time, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I did." I nodded, but there was no sense of satisfaction in it. There was nothing she could say to take back the hurt, the hollow space where my trust used to be. "I think it's time we accept that we're done," I said, the words feeling like a weight lifting off me. Her face crumpled. I could see her fighting the tears, but it was too late. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This wasn't something that could be salvaged with a few heartfelt words. It was finished. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said again, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I felt nothing. There was no anger, no sadness, just a quiet understanding that everything that had happened, the affair, the lies, the heartbreak, had brought us to this moment. There was no fixing it. There was no going back. "I know," I said, my voice calm now, But you already have. I watched as she stood up, her shoulders slumped, defeated. She hesitated at the door, looking back at me one last time, but I didn't move. There was nothing left to say. She left without another word. And in the silence that followed, I realized that I had already begun to move on. It would take time, of course, but in that moment, I knew I would be okay. I had already reclaimed something I hadn't even known I'd lost myself. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt like something I could face, alone but stronger than I had been before.